Okay, so I know I said that this week I would be doing a box office prediction video for the summer. That video is now either on the back burner or just isn't going to come out altogether. We are, entering now the second week basically of the summer season for film. And whilst I want to do that video, it is also important that on this channel we try and hit prescient and breaking news as quickly as possible. Now, this video isn't going to come out the day that this issue has happened. Obviously, we're about 3 or 4 days removed from it, but I wanted to give myself enough time to think about it and also to produce a video that is of a high enough quality that I don't feel like I'm phoning it in. So, as I say, box office video, that's probably on the back burner, probably isn't going to come out, or if it is, it'll not be till next week at least. In the meantime, on Sunday evening, I believe it was, President Trump went on social media. He went on his Truth Social platform and announced that he was planning to place tariffs, a 100% tariff on any movies that enter the US that aren't produced in the US. So that is any film coming out of Europe, China, Asia generally, South America, anywhere. There would be a 100% tariff immediately hitting it. Now, that is what he said. That is not necessarily what I believe he's going to do. In this video, I'm going to get deeper into what I actually believe his plans are, as well as discussing what a tariff actually is, and going into what the effect this will be on the US, Hollywood, on the US film industry, as well as the film industry elsewhere. Particularly, I'm going to be looking at the UK because I just know the film industry here the best, over somewhere like in Romania, where there is a big production sort of industry, but I'm not going to know very much about it. So let's start off with what is a tariff and what is Trump doing generally with tariffs. So a tariff is essentially a duty or a tax that is placed upon a product on top of its original sort of entry fee, I guess, or its price when it hits the consumer. And this is imposed by a national government for the means of usually protectionism, protecting the country that it's importing into, protecting that country's industries, whatever the respective industry might be. So typically this is seen in things like the car industry. Typically it's in things like steel, aluminium, and we'll get into those things in this video as well, where we're seeing these tariffs being introduced. The value of a tariff, how we work out what a tariff is basically a percentage of the value of the product becomes the tariff itself. So what I mean by that is if you have a product that is £10 or $10 in the US, if you say that 10% of that product's value is the tariff, then the 10% of that £10, that $10 would be £1. So the then true value with the tariff of that product becomes £11. This tax, this tariff, whilst it is placed on the importer of the good. So in the case of the US, think of places like Walmart, Best Buy, things like that. These are places that import foreign product and then sell them in their shops. Whilst that is the importer and that is the place where the tax is placed on, how those companies offset the price is to go, well, we're just going to have to charge the consumer more because our profits are being affected, our marginal lines are being affected and are essentially shrinking, which, is bad for growth, obviously, because you're regressing. And so to offset that, the importer says, right, well, we're going to place a price increase in, if you're using the example that I'm saying, of a pound or a dollar, then that goes from £10 to £11, it increases by 10%, which when you say it increases by 10%, it actually sounds a lot worse than if you say, oh, it's gone from £10 to £11. So these tariffs, these price increases never hit the importer really because they're just offsetting it to the consumer. So the person or the people involved who really suffer from tariffs is the consumer, With that being said, it also does hit the companies that produce these products or that import these products as well, because on the exporters side, it means that companies are less willing to take on foreign products because it becomes more expensive. And then on the importees side, on that company, that your Walmart, your Best Buy, that imports these products, they're less willing to take them on because of the perceived increase by the consumer and the potential unwillingness of the consumer to buy foreign products because it costs more. Now, this isn't something. Whilst Trump is now just announcing this for the film industry, this isn't something that he's just gone, oh, I'm going to place a tariff on the film industry. It's not something that isn't out of context. It's not something that doesn't come with background of Trump doing previously. So far, the things that we have seen Trump place tariffs on specific industries, I mean, is things like the auto parts industry, the automobile industry, steel, aluminium, oil, particularly from Venezuela and Russia. Although he has, I think, since reneged on the Russia part because he argues that trade between Russia and US is actually non-existent because of the Ukrainian war. That is also heavily contested. Venezuela is because they're essentially, going to war in a sense, not literally, but in a figurative sense, over the fact that Venezuela has a communist dictatorship government. And then solar panels. Solar panels, I think, chiefly come from China, and China has been the main target of these tariffs. And then on top of this, there is also just the reciprocal and the blanket tariffs, where Trump has said every country across the world will have a 10% baseline tariff. The reciprocal tariffs are, Trump introduced that 10%, then other countries go, well, we're going to institute 15%, and then Trump goes, all right, well, I'm going to institute 150%, which is kind of insane. And that is why we have seen a lot of the stock market crashes and the fears of a recession and things like that. However, the difference between the taxing the difference between the taxing of these products and the film industry is that the products I have mentioned here are goods. They are things that are specifically come into the country. They aren't what we would refer to in the film industry and in the entertainment industry writ large. They're not IP, they're not intellectual property. In a sense, in the way that aluminium, steel, cars, auto parts, oil, solar panels, all that sort of thing, in the way that these things exist, films, video games, music, those things don't exist in the same way. So it's hard to say, how does a song enter the US? How does a film enter the US when it really just exists on a hard drive? If a hard drive, if that's even what companies tend to use, I would expect actually a lot of these companies probably just have it on some sort of cloud system, a server that they've essentially just built to store their own products. So whilst those goods that I've discussed there, and those things are classified as goods, whilst they're easier to tax because they have to physically enter the US from a different country, films aren't the same. They're not classified the same. Films are classed as services rather than goods because they satisfy a need rather than, they satisfy a want, I should say, I suppose, rather than a need. A good is something that you need. A service, I would classify, in my mind, in my layman's opinion, I would classify it as something that you want. Service is a want. A good is something that you need. I wonder about the actual veracity of the ability to tax and to place tariffs on services. In my opinion, it seems pretty much illogical and almost impossible. So that is why, in my opinion, and this brings us on to the next point I've got on here, is that the tariffs that Trump has introduced so far have pretty much always been negotiation tactics. And these have been negotiation tactics for what Trump sees as better deals for the US. His opinion is that, generally speaking, the trade deals that the US is engaged in are bad for the US and are actually somewhat parasitic towards the US, which is to say that countries like China, Venezuela, Vietnam, India are willing and able to take advantage of the US because the US is addicted to cheap labor and cheap consumer products. And Trump's argument is that the US should be engaging in a sort of desire and a seeking out of higher quality products. And whilst it means that they would cost more, it would also mean that they're of a better quality. Trump's argument is also, of course, that these products should be made in the US rather than anywhere else. Although, as we are seeing, and as I say here, these tariffs are mainly negotiation tactics. Therefore, he is more than willing to take on a deal with a country and allow manufacturing to continue in that country as long as the deal is beneficial to the US. So I would imagine, whilst these deals haven't actually been released yet, none of these, for some reason, it's been going on for months now, and none of those have been released. My expectation would be that there will be some sort of, how would you say, like a first look deal. So a country like India or China, although China isn't actually going to negotiate a deal, I don't believe that's going to be the longest standing sort of trade war, essentially, trade war. A country like India or Vietnam will negotiate, and I wonder if the deal that Trump is looking for is a first look deal at a good price. And his argument is, or what he's seeking is, the right for the US to refuse any product or to accept any product, any import of any product before any country even is allowed to look at it. That's a guess. I'm not an economics, major or anything like that. So that's a guess. I would also expect that maybe they're just looking for a better price for companies like Walmart and Best Buy to import them, which would then ironically make it cheaper for companies to sell them. Although, you're not going to see a company decrease it or decrease the price. I mean, you're just going to see a company increase its profits, if anything. So all of this writ large, because I know I haven't, in this 15-minute video so far, haven't actually discussed any of how this affects the film industry, really. The background of this, before we get into the film industry section of this, is that Trump's plan and what he is seeking is an attempt to reshape global trade and to reshape the concept of globalization to something that is far more beneficial to the US than it currently is. Whilst in the long term, this is something that favours the US and industries, and I would argue, in a sense, the film industry itself. Whilst it is beneficial to the US and its industries long term, in the short term, there is major risks. There has already been one, if not multiple, stock market crashes. We have seen risks of recession and fears of it, and the bookmakers are essentially, betting on a recession being more likely at the end of this year or towards the end of this year than before these trade wars started. And then there is also the worries of how do you actually return manufacturing and industries to the US when the factories and the mills and things like that aren't there. They don't exist in the US anymore. They're run down or just outright destroyed. And that is because those industries have long since left the US. So even if a company turns around and goes, okay, we'll bring it back to the US, then the government is going to have to go, oh, hang on, wait, give us like 3 years to build you a factory. So there is also that of this takes time, and this all has to figure into essentially you are reshaping the economy, but you're doing it at the cost of short-term pain. And to voters and to people who have families to feed, that is something that is incredibly worrying to them. And so far, it isn't paying off, is the reality of the situation. Even if you think that this is worth it long term, you can't deny it and say, oh, it's working right. It's not, is the reality of the situation. By the end of the year, when we have seen those deals, and possibly those deals are starting to make or to take shape, possibly it will be worth it, but it's not right now, is the reality of the situation. But that's the background of the situation. Let's get into more of how this affects the film industry. So, what does a 100% film tariff actually look like, and who actually came up with this idea? One of the most vocal supporters in the 2024 election of Trump was Jon Voight. He is one of the most well-known supporters that I'm aware of. And of course, he's a famous movie star. Most recently, he was in Megalopolis, which I reviewed last year, and is quite possibly one of the funniest films I've ever seen. And in return for his loyalty, essentially, and his campaigning, Trump appointed him as the government ambassador to Hollywood. And one of the missions that Voight has been on since his appointment is an attempt with the studios, the streamers, the unions, the guilds, everyone else, alongside the government. He has been attempting to craft a plan to hand over to Trump and his team of how he believes we should return the film industry to the US and how we would go about that, how, what things we would offer in order to encourage them to come home, essentially. One of the quotes that I found in an article about this from Jon Voight and his team and his manager was that they believe, quote, by creating the right environment through smart incentives, updated policies, and much needed support, we can ensure that American production companies thrive, more jobs stay here at home, and Hollywood once again leads the world in creativity and innovation. Now, as I understand it, that was a quote that was quite out there in terms of people are aware of that quote. And this wasn't just in any site. I believe this was from maybe Vulture. So this is something that, Hollywood press was aware of. In that quote, that original quote, there is no mention of tariffs. Below that, in the second quote that you can see on your screen, I do have a separate quote from him where he says that they should be willing to use tariffs in certain limited circumstances. Tariffs was not the crux of the plan. It was not the main focus of the plan. It was simply a tool that when a company was going, no, we don't want to leave. Romania is offering us tax incentives and they're so cheap and we have all these locations. Then maybe a tariff would come in and go, okay, any film that is produced in Romania, we're going to place a tax on it because we're offering you tax incentives, we're offering you access to locations, and you're still not taking it. But as I understand it, and as Jon Voight and his team are saying, he did not say just tariff everything. Place a tax on any movie that's coming into the US from any other country. That's not what he said. He's just saying and essentially proposing to use tariffs as a tool to get what they want. But alongside that, it's updated policies, smart incentives, and much needed support. There's also things in there like job training, which I thought was very interesting. Essentially saying, that maybe if we want to return the industry back, then who's actually going to take those jobs? In places like Romania and London particularly, but the UK generally, and France and Germany, there's highly specialized industries for film, highly specialized freelance workers who are there and who are willing to do the work. Is that there in the US? I'm not saying no, I'm not saying yes, but if production, particularly in Hollywood, is going down and down and down, it makes sense that people are going to move from there to London, Romania, France, Germany, maybe even somewhere like Brazil, China, India. because there's booming industries there. Maybe not booming films coming out of those countries in terms of British-owned films, but films are being produced in those countries that will be successful, that will be well paid. Most recently, a film that's coming out in, I believe, a month, in June, is Jurassic World Rebirth, which was shot in Hertfordshire, which is in the south of the UK. That's like a premier Hollywood blockbuster that isn't being produced in the US, which, almost from a patriotism angle and a nationalism angle, feels incredibly weird to me. For me, if the, scenes set in like the MI6 HQ of a James Bond movie, if those scenes were shot in the US, I'd be like, what the fuck? That's fucking weird. Those scenes should be shot in London, or at least the UK, but mainly London. Like, that's where MI6 is headquartered. It's a British property. It's an institution of British culture. It should be shot there. So I would hope and I would think that American blockbusters view it the same way. But that's not the case. For whatever reason, it's too expensive. They don't have the right locations. They don't have the right specialized sort of teams. All that sort of thing. So John Voight proposes this plan. He takes it to Trump and his team. This plan isn't public, but it is well known that John Voight is working on this. He's working on a plan to bring the industry back to Hollywood and to back to America writ large. This isn't public. None of this is public, other than the meeting and the desire to return the industry to the US. Trump then takes this public and just announces on Truth Social, and he places a heavy focus on tariffs. So let's get into that statement now. So he heads over to Truth Social, which is his platform. When he got booted off Twitter, that's where he went. And he says on there, secondhand, because I'm not on there, don't worry. There's my virtue signal for this video. I'm not on there, don't worry. And he says, quote, "Other countries are offering all sorts of incentives to draw our filmmakers and studios away from the United States. Hollywood and many other areas within the US are being devastated. This is a concerted effort by other nations and therefore a national security threat. It is, in addition to everything else, messaging and propaganda. Therefore, I am authorizing the Department of Commerce and the United States Trade Representative to immediately begin the process of instituting a 100% tariff on any and all movies coming into our country that are produced in foreign lands." Let's go through it like essentially sentence by sentence. But it's so interesting to me that he starts this off by mentioning incentives and saying all these other countries are offering incentives, and then doesn't say, no, we're going to start offering that. He just goes, yeah, 100% tariff. Like, it has become such a buzzword for him and something to hit on and to essentially strike fear into an industry, rather than actually going, is there a pull factor here? Is there some way that we can pull an industry back into the US rather than just push it away from the country that it's currently in? And I'm not saying that tariffs aren't a legitimate sort of tool in the toolbox, but it's just so interesting to me that he mentions it and then doesn't go on to say, well, we're going to hit them with a tariff, but also we're going to be offering more tax incentives. Nothing like that. It just doesn't exist. And so he says that, and then he says Hollywood and many other areas are being devastated. That's true. We can see that in the numbers, particularly Hollywood. Year-on-year production in Hollywood and California is down by percent. Production budgets that are used in California are down every year. That's true. Then he says that it's a national security threat and that it's messaging and propaganda. And this is where I think it becomes a bit dicey. I'm not really sure about the national security threat argument, because that just feels like something that he's throwing out there, because he knows that, his base identifies the film industry and a lot of entertainment industries writ large as being woke. So he'll be like, oh, it's a national security threat because they're exporting dangerous ideologies from another country, and those countries are teaching American citizens about woke things, and then those people are returning from work in Romania and are bringing those ideologies back into the US. I'm not saying that's definitely what he's saying, but I feel like that might be what he's trying to hit on. But the argument of it's messaging and propaganda is something that I can sort of get behind and sort of understand. When Disney is actively participating with the Chinese government to make movies like Mulan in China and in the province where concentration camps exist of the Uyghur Muslim ethnic minority, that is propaganda. Whether it's direct, whether it's subversive, whether it's subverting and it's indirect, whatever it is, that is propaganda. Because an American company is working with the Chinese government. And, there's a thank you in the credits to the provincial government and to the national government of China. So I think that is propaganda personally. And I would personally view that as a national threat. I understand where he's coming from on that argument. I don't think writ large this is a national security threat. I think that's just a bit of a buzzword. But then, he says, all right, we're going to start instituting a 100% tariff. That, again, to me, is purely just him saying, we want these studio streamers, guilds, unions at the table to negotiate. How do we bring this back to America? But it's just such a weird negotiating tactic to go, we're going to start off on a negative foot. We're not going to go, other countries are offering tax incentives, so we're going to try and beat those tax incentives. And if that isn't enough to bring them back, we're going to surgically and in certain scenarios institute tariffs. There's none of that. It's just very aggressive, and I understand that that's kind of Trump's whole, personality and persona and ideology. I get it. And, it works for him clearly very well. But it's such in the world of business, I don't know if that's necessarily a great tactic when I'm not sure these companies in this instance need to return. Because once again, how do you tariff a piece of intellectual property? It's nigh on impossible. So I just don't know what the plan is here, and it just feels like a bit of a buzzword. But again, for his base, the mention of tariffs is something that is clearly able to strike at the heart of what his base wants, or at least what he perceives his base to want. I'm not actually sure what his approval rating is looking like now. My assumption is that the tariffs are probably hitting some people harder than others, and perhaps those people that it's hitting are going, shit, I didn't know this. But yes, it's a very strange way of starting off negotiations. I wouldn't hate it if he said we're going to start implementing tariffs if they're not willing to return. But he doesn't then offset that by saying, but we're also going to offer tax incentives. There's none of that. There's no stick and carrot approach. There's just a stick. And in this case, I'm not sure that's necessarily going to work, given the classification of the film industry as a service industry rather than a goods industry, because you just can't tariff it the same way. So I'm not really sure what his plan is in this instance. And then we come on to what I believe is the final slide. No, it's the third slide. But we come on to what could actually happen in terms of how would you tax this, or how would you tariff this? How would you go about it if you can at all? And again, so films, services, not goods. So there's no feasible way to tax the actual property, the product of, let's say, 28 Days Later has just been shot and edited and filmed and everything up here where I live in the northeast of England. There's no way to go, here is the product, and now it's in there's no way of feasibly doing that in a sense where you can tax it. So in that sense, you then need to try and find some other way to tax it. So as I've got here, an analyst is quoted as saying, tariffs typically apply to the import of goods. So a tariff on DVD imports is easy to enforce, and a tariff on intellectual property, IP, is nearly impossible to enforce. So you then have to question, where does the tariff go? And if it's impossible to tariff the actual product, you have to, as this analyst Alicia Reese says, you then have to tax the industries within the industry. So is it, as she says, DVDs, Blu-rays, collector's editions, like things like that, which are already very expensive. So if you put a tariff on them, it's basically going to drive those industries into the ground, and it's going to make it much, much more of a collector's industry. And then I don't see how you're really helping that industry whatsoever. You have pre-production. So do you tax if a film goes, we're going to go here to the UK and we're going to get a tax incentive from the UK government? Do you go, all right, well, we're not going to offer you any sort of tax incentive, and if you, I don't know, try to buy products from the US to work on that film, we're going to place taxes on it. That's a very hyper-specific case, and I just don't think that's very tangible. I don't think that there's any way that you could meaningfully do that, because you can't do that on a film-to-film basis unless you're going to literally assign a couple hundred people to, this is your job. Every time a film company in another country applies for a product from the US, you have to tax them yourself. I'm just not sure how you do that. So then in post-production, so things like VFX, CGI, so I'm mixing myself up. So things like VFX, the premieres, bringing stars to the American premiere, cinemas, physical media. Do you tax these things? VFX is already incredibly expensive. I was just, weirdly, before I started recording this video, I was watching the Fast and Furious trailers for like the last 3 movies. I don't know why I was doing that. I was procrastinating. The last movie, like Fast 10, apparently cost like $340 million to make. And that movie's all CGI. So if you place a tariff on VFX, how much more does that movie cost? Is that an additional 30, 40 million? Then cinemas, if you place tariffs on cinema tickets, that's it. The cinema industry in the US will be gone. It might not be immediate, it may not take 6 months to a year, but give it 10 years of a tariff, that industry will be gone. And you'd only have your hyper-focused, small, sort of community cinemas that exist basically because they're just a charity with, rich backers. Physical media, as I've already said, would basically be gone. So there's no, in my opinion, feasible way, whether it's the industry writ large and it's the tariffs placed on intellectual property, or whether it's the tariffs on the industries within the industry. I don't see a tangible way of taxing this. I don't see how you could eliminate variables or find a way to do it with so few variables, because every way has a number of variables that you're just not going to be able to account for. And if you do account for them, it's going to be extremely costly anyways to eliminate them or to mitigate the risk. So this industry is too fluid. It's not something that you can tax. And I think a good comparison for this would be the video game industry, where video game companies, PlayStation and Nintendo, particularly Nintendo, because they're now in the launch period of their Switch 2. These video game companies seem very skittish about these tariffs and don't know what to do. And you may then go, well, isn't that just the same? That's intellectual property. The difference there is a physical product that those companies sell. The Switch, the PlayStation, the Xbox. It's different in that industry because you can place a tariff on that thing itself. So the film industry is something that is particularly fluid, in my opinion, when it comes to tariffs, and it's particularly hard to tax. And physical media in films is dead. Like, it doesn't exist except for if you're like someone who enjoys the art of collecting it, or if you're just someone who doesn't want to really submit to a streamer every time you want to watch a film. So there are, as John Voight had apparently written up in his plan, better ways of doing this that I don't believe are being considered, and it is a mistake to not consider them. So, tax incentives, skill training, work training, government grants. These are better ways to help this industry that is desperately in need of help. Trump is right about one thing. Hollywood is dying, and the film industry in the US is dying. It needs help, but this is not the way that help is coming. It's not a good enough idea. It doesn't. How do you operatively do this? And I would actually even be more in favor of Trump saying, we will offer tax incentives to these companies if they come home. But for every time they leave and they go to what we consider an enemy of the US, we will take away tax incentives. I would actually be more on board with that idea. But, all right, you want to go shoot a film in China? All right, you can do that. We'll let you. We're not going to place a tariff on you. But don't come asking for tax incentives for another year, because go and ask that. Go and ask them. You want to work with them, so go and work with them. We don't want you here right now because we're going to give this other company that is willing to stay in-house in the US, we're going to give them that money. And I think this industry in particular is something that requires government help. Everyone is of that opinion. But because of the fluidity and the lack of a physical art form, and the fact that cinemas are already struggling and in many cases are on their last legs, it needs financial help, not more pressure. And all that I see from this is pressure, not help. And so, we'll come on to the final conclusions, basically. And as I've already said, this is a real problem. It's just not a good solution. And no one in Hollywood is denying that there is a problem here. This year, Warner Brothers is taking major risks with its filmmaking. If out of nowhere they were suddenly having tariffs on those films, which I don't know for certain, but let's just say, I know one. Mickey 17, I believe, was shot in the UK. If that film that cost like 150 million didn't break even, if that film then had a 10% tariff on it, it's fucked. And Warner Brothers, given the slight financial trouble that it's been in this year, which has now majorly been offset by a Minecraft movie, if it had that tariff, what does its year look like? It's going to be massively, massively struggling. And this isn't a help, it's a hindrance for it. But Trump's solution is, if anything, this isn't a real thing that he's actually going to do. For all the fear-mongering that has existed and for the length of this video so far, this is a negotiating tactic. I don't think he has actually any intention of placing this tariff on the industry. The difference here is there's no feasible way of doing it, so I don't believe it's a good negotiating tactic anyways. But it is also an attention-grabbing tactic. It is something that will get people talking, as I'm doing now. It is also something that will get the attention of the industry to go, shit, we need to sit down and actually have a conversation with them. And it is also something that just generally just keeps him in the press. It keeps him in the news 24/7. Because now it's, oh, what does this mean? What is his plan? But there is no way to do this. So it is nothing more than a negotiating and attention-seeking tactic. That is what it is ultimately, and I think it can be boiled down to that, if nothing else. This, in many ways, ignores the real issue to me, which is that the industry doesn't have a way to return. It's not financially feasible right now for them to come to the US when they can go to another country and make their production of 28 Days Later or Mickey 17. They can go to the UK and make the film $10 or $20 million cheaper, and they will have access to specialized labor in that country. It just doesn't make sense for them to be in the US because what is there? There's no tax incentives, there's no specialized workforce, there's none of these things. There's not even, in many cases, some executives seem to claim that there's not even the locations that they want. So it doesn't make sense to then add this financial pressure because it's like, well, what do we do? Like, we're under more pressure now to return, but there's nowhere for us to return to. And if anything, this, in my opinion, will just make it so that studios will take fewer risks if this came in. They will focus even more on films like a Minecraft movie and Super Mario Bros. and whatever else is out there, Barbie, Jumanji, films like that are almost certified to make $1 billion, if not just under. And it will destroy middle to low productions. Maybe a company like an A24 can just go, all right, we'll return to the US and we'll shoot primarily there or nowhere else even. But a company that's even smaller than A24, I can't even think of one off the top of my head, but say if you have one that's smaller than that and that is purely indie, maybe a Shudder, I would say, how are they going to do that? Shudder doesn't earn massive amounts of money. It earns maybe its profit margins, I would imagine, are good, but it's not bringing in $50 to $100 million a year, I would imagine. Probably more in the maybe 15 to 20 million region, I would imagine. So it would destroy companies like that. There would be no feasible way that they could work abroad or in the US. The point writ large is that if this is a negotiating tactic, if this helps to bring these studio streamers, guilds, unions to the table with the government and negotiate and find a way to return the film industry to the US and to make it cheaper and less expensive in a time when budgets are majorly out of control, then I ultimately believe that is a good thing. But it's ultimately just, in this modern era, extremities seems to be the only method that we can negotiate with. It's the only way to catch attention, the only way to negotiate, it's the only way to talk on social media. And it ultimately just adds to that pile of things that are annoying because you can't have a normal conversation about it. You can't go, we want this industry to return to the US. How do we do that in a way that isn't going to destroy you and that will actually help you and will help the industry boom? Instead, it's a whip to get back in line and to return to the US. There's no actual conversation about what is it that you need? What is it that we can offer you to help you come back? There's none of that. And it's ultimately just annoying, but like I say, if it makes these films, the film industry bring its budgets back under control and make films more affordable, whether it's in the pocket of the consumer in cinemas and in physical media, or just in making films in general, therefore making them more profitable and therefore helping us make more movies and hopefully more good movies, then you have to be in favor of that in a sense, even if it's just annoying. I'm going to leave that there. I feel like I've covered a pretty good amount of this, and although I think this video is probably about 45 minutes, I feel like I've come out of this in a reasonable amount of time. I've also not lost my rag with this, which I felt like it was a considerable possibility. But ultimately, remember, this is a negotiating tactic. There's no way that this tariff can feasibly come in. And it is just now about how the industry responds and if it's willing to negotiate with Trump. If it's not, that's when I do go, oh shit, okay, what does that mean? Is he actually going to try and introduce this? Which, because he can't, but he's too stubborn and arrogant to just accept that he can't, how does that affect the industry where he goes, yeah, I'm just going to do whatever I want. I'll find something here to tax. And that's what I would be worried about. But anyways, video's long enough. I feel like I've covered enough. If this is something that interests you, please let me know in the comments. I will reply to as many as I can. Keep it civil. I know that this is a politics thing, but keep it civil. Thank you. So, like, comment, subscribe, find TikTok in the page, all that sort of stuff. Letterboxd, Twitter, everything. All right. Bye.